A good starting point, having had the privilege to listen to Rachel and to Richard, is perhaps to bring in with a quick set of questions our new panelists. Andrew, perhaps while you're in such a contemplative mood between Richard and Rachel, starting with you. What are your thoughts, given your brief around identity, on new identity proofing methods, especially pattern of life methodologies?
What name-based checking processes have allowed us to do, though, is get quite comfortable dealing with volume crime problems. I think some of you may recall, certainly the Australians here, Today Tonight, or not Today Tonight, one of those current affairs shows a few years ago when Pauline Hanson went to Thailand and acquired a number of New South Wales driver licences in the name of Julia Gillard. Well, our system deals with those kinds of false problems. But my experience previously in customs and dealing in the intelligence area was criminal activity is all about action-reaction. I think we put in place a reasonably robust biographical name-based checking system in the DVS. The criminals look for other ways to move around it. Where we've gone to in recent times in policy and also in program type delivery is trying to put in place systems that allow us to bind the identity to the individual and see it operating in the community. So one of the things we have underway at the present moment is around biometric checking, looking to implement a national facial biometric matching capability that allows us to check the photo to source. And what that deals with is the imposter, the identity takeover scenario. And that's something we're just trying to get a handle on at the moment as the DVS, the Document Verification Service, operates very efficiently. Are we starting to see a move of methodology to that identity takeover? So moving to a process where there is biometric checking helps us to deal with some of those risks. But the whole question about the identity operating in the community takes us to whether there are other methodologies possible, and Louis mentioned the pattern of life analysis, looking at patterns of activity of an individual and looking to see whether they are in keeping with what you would expect with that kind of individual. How many times the doctor, how many times using the mobile phone, patterns of use in banking and so forth, and using that to answer that question about is the identity presented actually one that's real and operating in the way you would expect that identity to operate. Now, name-based checking and biometric checking processes are things that government are quite comfortable with in many respects. I think that issue around pattern of life is something that we're doing in some parts. Some of our large regulatory agencies do that, but I think there's a real opportunity for some of the companies who are represented today to assist government to understand the opportunities that might exist with that pattern of life analysis. We know that kind of analysis exists in credit reference agencies. We know it's used in the insurance industry as well. There's certainly an opportunity for pattern of life as a service, if you like, to help government look at a range of flexible methodologies to answer the question about are we dealing with the person who we think we're dealing with. I mean, there are some related issues around that pattern of life analysis about when we get into the realms of the Privacy Act, about information collected for a purpose being used for another purpose, and we also get into the question about is the individual as the customer consenting in an informed way to that data being used for those kinds of purposes. And that's something that we would need to work through with those kinds of approaches. But I think that it really beholds government, and it probably beholds a number of private sector organisations as well, to look at different approaches to identity assurance. And I've put the pattern of life analysis as one that for further exploration.
Thank you. Much appreciated, Andrew. Moving to you, Richard, from a security perspective, our theme deals with this always on world. Given what you're working with, what do you think we're missing in terms of vulnerabilities, and what would you regard as the most important vulnerabilities that we should be focusing on currently?
So I think one of them is, the key vulnerabilities that we sort of miss. Thanks very much. is the fact that we focus a little bit too much on perimeter protection. Perimeter protection and firewalls and all those sorts of things are very important, but going back to some of the other speakers today, the idea of actually protecting or using those limited resources to actually protect some of the trophy systems or the trophy information is very important. So I think we can do a lot more to ensure that if we are breached, we can protect the data that means the most to the organisation or to the individual. Another one is around IoT. So IoT's become very prevalent, so Internet of Things, devices are connected. Unfortunately though, a lot of those devices, they concentrate very heavily on the functionality, and that's certainly the push for the developers of those devices, not so much on features like the security, so especially talking about authentication between trusted parties for those devices, and in particular also update of those devices. A lot of devices that are out there now can't be updated, and that's a surefire way to ensure that you're going to get vulnerabilities, and then that's going to pervade through the rest of the devices that you use.
I am reminded of a great quote from Steve Jobs that I like a lot. At one point he explained that every day he goes to work at the intersection of technology and the liberal arts. And I would say that in the 5 years since his passing, that intersection is busier than ever before. Just during the break now, I was amazed at the range of people I met here. Hardcore engineers, technologists, government officials, lobbyists, lawyers, the whole mix. This room really is the living and breathing embodiment of Steve Jobs' idea and vision of how we need to operate in this world. And so the answer to your question basically is yes, all of the above. But the way we get there is by bringing people like this together. It is by having a conversation with people who can go super deep technically, as well as know movies and everything else, and try to build consensus and try to find the right balance on these tough issues.
I'd like to return to that observation of yours and how we could move closer to that common platform. But perhaps coming back again to the by design buzzwords and concepts, because I'd like to return to Richard too on that one, and what you see as the content of that, how you view it and what it entails and how you see its role in our discussion.
Well, I'll take it from a sort of pure tactical corporate perspective first, and then address some of the larger policy questions. So for the past 10 years or so, I've been what we call a product lawyer at Microsoft, which is I roll up organizationally in the legal department, but I actually sit with the engineering teams, with the business teams. So for the past X number of years, I've been sitting with Office and Skype for Business, and those folks who build the products, where we live privacy by design, where we live implementation, where we live with the customer demands and customer expectations. I've met with many an official in Germany dealing with those issues, which is why we launched data centers in Germany as well. And we have similar and related issues all around the world. So pure tactics, absolutely. You have to live privacy by design. You have to execute, and you have to execute well, or you simply won't have the trust of not users, consumers, customers, who will utilize those services. That's absolutely critical. But I do think it's important to look at this from sort of a broader policy perspective and not just the tactics of implementing privacy by design. Because it's very easy, particularly in a room like this, where we have so many people familiar with technology, to get lost in the buzzwords. And certainly, technology changes and buzzwords change, but our core principles should remain the same. And so in point of fact, we've actually had conversations like this many, many times in the past. Just a couple of quick examples. When railroads started outpacing horses and buggies, both literally and figuratively, I suppose, what happened? A whole new body of law developed, railroad law. And we had really tough, challenging public policy questions about how you deal with railroads. When Henry Ford created the Model T and the ubiquitization of automobiles, what happened again? An entirely new body of law developed with also equally tough, challenging public policy issues and questions. We found the right balance to those buzzwords at that time. And I'm confident we'll find the right balance at this time as well to this year's buzzword, whether it's privacy by design, whether it's over-the-top communications, whether it's, pick the buzzword you've heard this morning. I'm actually very positive and optimistic that we'll find the right spot.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tom. Richard, please correct me if I misquote you, but you said privacy by design entails for you getting security hygiene right.
Yeah.
Would you care to expand on that?
Yeah, so I'm probably a fairly sort of boring oppo type person who just wants to make sure things work properly. And I think that if we look at security, I always regard it as being the same but different in whatever environment you're in. You're going to have different changes, but you've got to go through a whole set of different disciplines in order to make sure that it works, which is why I show that structure. That's why we have a structured approach to it. So to give an example, if we look at Internet of Things, which is just coming through, I look at it quite simply. That's just another endpoint, isn't it? So we go through the whole process around risk strategy. What's the strategy for our organization in introducing that? Is it to make our processes run better, to get better data? What is the strategic imperative that we're supporting? What is the risk we have to manage coming out of that? That will then go to the architecture and the design, and we'll have to make sure we're compliant. So we'll just run through a whole series of disciplines around that. There will be technical issues, but that's just part of the implementation side of things. So when we start to look at, let's take another buzzword, cloud. It's just, what are the business issues? What's the strategy? What are we going to fulfill? And we just have to go through this constant process the whole time in order to make sure we get those core hygiene aspects put in. I think one of the failings of security in the past is it's been siloed, it's been technology driven, and it's come at the issue from different points of view and different places. So let's just get some discipline in the process, get a structure, and put everything through it. So when you start to bring in a new application, it is seen within context rather than just as a new application. So it's just following that process through.
Andrew.
I thought maybe I could add a practical example. I mentioned before the work that we're doing on the national facial biometric matching capability. And I guess the purists would say we're adopting a privacy by design approach. I think what we've been trying to do is make sure that we design privacy and security in at the front end so we don't have to retrofit something at the back end. And I really think that it's, thus far it's been quite a simple if busy process, and it probably goes to some of the points that Tom was making about multidisciplinary teams. I mean, I've got a bunch of IT contractors who've all got titles. I say I'll know what they do when they've finished, because I'm not quite sure what they do at this present moment, other than delivering an IT system. I've got lawyers working with me. I've got policy people who are managing relationships with key stakeholders. And through some external providers, some of whom are in the room today, we're moving through privacy PIA type processes as well. We have coalitions of stakeholders in state governments, and it's about working that whole ecosystem of supporters, if you like, to come up with a design at the front end which is going to work. And I think it sounds in some ways like a mountain to climb, but we find it a very effective way to manage what is a high stakes but high reputational type issue to deliver something that protects privacy, is secure, but delivers on the law enforcement and national security outcomes we seek.
Thank you, Andrew. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, I would like to open the floor to questions. Again, please, if you have a question, state your name and your organisation. I see a hand in the middle. You can just catch my eye and I'll try and see you batting the lights.
Hi, Rizwan from eSafe Systems. Great discussions going on, and especially on the fact that it's a people issue, not only a technology issue. And I saw a couple of times Edward Snowden come in the picture by a number of discussions. If you look at the recent, all the attacks and all the hacks or whatever, it's always, if coming from a ex-ethical hacker myself, we always target the authorized user. We have nothing to do with unauthorized access. We always target the insider. We always target the person inside, and a lot of time, which we have found out is always the inside guy who has either leaked information or stolen information or whatever happens. what is your take on this issue, and how should we solve this particular dilemma, which is, well, a lot of statistics say 60-70% is involving just this problem?
Thank you for the question. Who would like to take a bite at that? Rachel?
Oh, I think I've got a mic on here. Look, obviously, there's a raft of issues. There's a raft of measures you can take. You know, the first thing, if you've got it, I mean, to my MPAA example before, for example, I had to have every single person in my entire organisation pass a police check. You know, fairly basic kind of thing to do. When you get to other, you know, high levels, but fundamentally, what you've got to ensure is that your teams that are dealing with really sensitive stuff are actually known. That your teams are organised in a logical enough way, in a small enough way, that you actually know them as people, and have a view of whether or not people are going around systems or not. Because to my point earlier, if somebody can go around a system because it's faster and more convenient, that's a weakness. But can you guard against Edward Snowden? Snowden would probably not have been as successful if he hadn't actually had the credentials of some other people. Certainly, he had a lot of privileged access. That's, again, you don't solve that with education. You solve that with business design, with the structure of the business, the way you organise your teams, and the way that people's work practices are designed. It's not just about the infrastructure. It's actually about how do they do their jobs. Those things are really important. There's no magic bullet. You can't ever guard against an insider going completely rogue. But you can try and make it so that at least people know when they're going a little bit off the reservation, because they can kind of see that they're not really happy.
I think there's another point to be made there, and certainly credential protection is a big part of that, but also deprovisioning. So a lot of organisations actually do the provisioning of users and what they need access to very well now. And when a person leaves, they also generally do it all right. You know, they get rid of access that person might have had. Where it actually becomes a problem is as people step through an organisation, and that's not done as well. So if a person starts as an administrator, they might have access to databases or the administration accounts that they need to do their job. And then what generally happens in an organisation is when they become a manager, they get all of those rights still, and then all the ones that they need to do their current job. And that's what we need to do. We need to focus on actually making sure they have the rights and access that they need to do the job that they're doing at the time. And that might change quite frequently, and that's the challenge.
One slightly higher up level point here, I would note that smart customers in general and smart customers in particular are really forcing this on us as well. Very smart customers know that this is a pain point, and they will dictate things to us. And so there are certain steps that we need to make to accommodate certain customer interests, especially in the public sector. And of course, we in turn do that to our vendors as well. Like, I'll use an example. We retain law firms, and increasingly they're demanding that certain law firms provide certain security credentials and security protections and meet certain ISO standards. That includes some requirements and obligations on their part for how their people deal with data and individual concerns and stuff like that. So the customer piece is also not to be forgotten here.
Thank you so much. I noted the following question.
Thank you. Stephen Wilson from Constellation Research. I'd like the panel to address this always on theme. It's not just always on, it's always everything's connected to everything. It's a leading question because I think that information security practice is busted. I don't think that it's up to the job of always on and everything connected to everything. You know, we're still talking about perimeter security, we're still talking about firewalls, we're talking about penetration testing, modularity, linear processes. When everything's connected to everything all the time, the slightest failure brings everything down. And I'm wondering what your reflections are on what we might do with security practice next to deal with what I think is a different architecture.
Excellent. Thank you, Stephen. Richard.
Yeah, I mean, there are two interpretations of always on. It's that always connectivity, and how do you keep going always on? I think that you're right, there's connectivity, and I think there's a session today on ubiquitous connectivity, which is, I think, probably the key driver for the fourth industrial revolution. It's the fact that we are continually exchanging data is going to be critical. In terms of the security practice, again, I think we're going to have the same disciplines, but how we actually implement it will change. And that's why I brought up this issue of scale. How do we actually look at all of that mass connectivity and get a picture of it so that we know what is going on? I think that when we get into this new world, we're going to find that a lot of those endpoint devices will be too small to have security on them. So we're going to have to be able to get that single view a lot more easily. So some of the things that we've been doing, for example, as tests around that, are things like DNS analysis. Now, for any techie in the room, that's just a huge, huge issue. How do you deal with that scale? But if we can start to look at that kind of activity and start to analyze billions and billions of events the whole time, we will then be able to deal with this mass distributed, constant interconnectivity. We can then start to look at building profiles around the connection as you would be doing. Is that the right person connecting? What are the characteristics of that connectivity in order to ensure that that device or that phone or whatever it is the right one coming through? It hasn't been compromised. So I think we're going to have to look at how we address that issue of scale. And I don't want to launch into big data being one of the other ones. We're going to have to start to bring that in terms of how we merge those together to give us that scale going forward. So I think you're right. If we continue thinking about firewalls and so forth, I think that story's done and gone. I don't think anybody's there anymore. I think a firewall's great for giving you control and information as to what's going on. But we're going to have to look at how we spread out those endpoints and then how we actually bring in that single point of view by defining security at scale.
Thank you so much, Richard. I'm going to defer the question over there. David?
I'm David Watts, the Commissioner for Privacy and Data Protection in Victoria. A comment and a question. As I guess I think the only privacy and security regulator in the country who's explicitly adopted privacy by design and security by design, I'm so gratified and amazed at the sophistication of the conversation today. Privacy by design and that design type philosophy has been around for a while, but really hasn't been subject to a sort of the sort of widespread discourse that I've heard in the room today, and I think that that's a really fantastic development because they're methodologies that are really the only risk-based methodologies around at the moment that actually lead us to the position that I think you were talking about, Tom, of being able to have a conversation at the intersection of all of the issues. Although I'm not sure that there are too many people here who could claim to be aficionados of the liberal arts. But I had a question for you, Tom. You indicated before that privacy by design was a buzzword. And my question to you, my unfair question to you, is don't you think that risks a trivialisation of really what are the only tools around?
I would say no. In this industry, I don't view buzzword as a pejorative, actually. I mean, seriously. I said OTT is a buzzword. I love OTT. I'm completely passionate about OTT. I have Skype cufflinks on right now. That's how passionate I am about OTT. So when I say it's a buzzword, that's not a negative. It just happens to be something that people are focused on today. One of the challenges, I think, in the phrase privacy by design is that it means everything and nothing to people. In some jurisdictions, it is a quantifiable test and standard. Perhaps in Victoria it is one, but in other jurisdictions around the world, it is rhetoric, not backed by action. And so one of the challenges, especially at a large event, we've got lots of people, and even more so at sort of very large global events, is how do we define that? I'm sort of shocked we've gone 5 questions and not a single question about the Apple case, which is fascinating. But a year and a half ago, Apple launched a privacy by design website and web page, and it was tremendous, frankly, from a privacy perspective. It was clear, it was concise, it was understandable to regular users, and it was fabulous, beautifully well done. And now we know, with the case, they are walking the talk. Right? They didn't just put up a fancy website that looked all pretty. They're actually following up on it. And the reason you reference that is just I'm not convinced everybody who says privacy by design is actually following through with privacy by design. And certainly one of your challenges as a regulator, and I hear this from European DPAs all the time, is lots of people can talk the talk and say they're committed. The real challenge comes when you're challenged. The real challenge comes when there's a breach. The real challenge comes when the government says, go break the encryption on that iPhone. What are you going to do then? And that's where the rubber hits the road.
I think in terms of policy, just to get back to the recent changes, you mentioned that the EU and the UK changes with the GDPR that's coming in. There, I think it's becoming quite specific. I love this as a bit of documentation. It starts off by saying this will reduce the administrative burden and simplify issues, and then gives you 200 pages of legalese to go through. So once you've gone through that, it actually gets really quite prescriptive as to what you need to do in terms of achieving privacy by design. And down to the governance factor as well, where the DPO has got to be independent, senior, and non-sackable for having complained. So I think that's probably a huge improvement to getting some standardisation. You then combine that with the recent safe harbour decision, which said if you are going to transfer data, you've got to make sure you stick to this. And then there's a great big stick as well to beat the living daylights out of you call 4% of global turnover. So I think that we can be a lot clearer about privacy design. It's coming through. We can be extra jurisdictional, and we've seen that work in other types of legislation, like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which has gone globally. So we're now going to see that going globally as well. So I think we're going to get privacy by design, by policy, coming through in the next few years.
If I can follow that up, Louis, is that all right? I agree with you. One of the most persistent issues that comes to me is how do you go about implementing privacy by design? It's principle-based, just like privacy legislation is, just like security is. And people find it difficult, I think, to translate those principles into practice. And so we've just published guidelines to information sharing in the public sector. It's a lovely document. I recommend you all read it. It was published last Friday. But in consultation about that, the persistent question and criticism of the document was people were wanting me to give answers to them. Can I do this? Can I not do this? And I think as a regulator with all of this, it's really important to understand from a privacy by design and a security by design perspective. There's not a standard suite of answers, or not a standard single answer. There's a margin of appreciation. And so long as you have gone through and asked yourself the right questions, done the right risk analysis, which is what Andrew's trying to do, as I understand it, with the biometrics project, then you do get to the right answers. There may be a range of right decisions around it. I think it's really important not to be fearful, and I think it's really important to be confident enough to work with the principles to produce really good outcomes.
Just to follow on very briefly on that.
Very quick response, and then we may have time for a last question over there.
There's masses of standards that you can follow. The security industry is full of standards. We love standards. We'll produce them the whole time. But that's why we had that structured end-to-end approach, so you could go through, take a principled approach, take those standards, apply them to something realistic, so that you've gone through all of the different disciplines that you need to.
What he said. That's exactly what I was saying.
Perfect. Great to have this alignment. We have, I think, probably the last question for the session before lunch.
I'll make a light one then. It's David Horton from NEC. I wondered if you see a change in attitudes to privacy and security after the last few years. 10 years ago, with the advent of social media, digital natives have put everything that they own online, but even digital immigrants are happy to give up their credentials in order to get access to services. And also with the recent spate of terrorist attacks that have been publicised around the world, people are willing to submit to more stringent controls. So we're seeing a shift in attitudes there.
Any response to that? Do you in shifts that you perhaps have seen?
I think it's been hard to predict, from a government trying to design programs within government. It doesn't always follow the demographics. You'd think that the younger folk would be less fussed about giving up their data. That doesn't necessarily follow. I think your example, Rachel, of the older people, sometimes potentially more accepting. I just find that, well, certainly from the government perspective, we've got to sort of take a bit of a worst case scenario in terms of design, that we do all we can to protect the information, and I guess we test the designs with people to understand where community conventions are going, and it's I guess it is a moving feast, but at the moment I'd say we're still on the edge of the spectrum of we need to look after people's information. They're not interested in it being squandered by government programs.
I think it's a further thing to that. If you ignore the social media part for a second, though, certainly in terms of the data that the government holds, and to some extent businesses as well, have a vested interest in protecting that data, because to the degree that which they allow any of that data to leak out, but not by consent of the user, they compromise their own systems. So that point of proof of record ownership or any of those sorts of things, the more data that's out there, the more vectors there are for mistreating that data in the future. So this is, the point about data sharing, even social media and stuff, it's an ecosystem. And different cultures have different approaches. I've done a lot of work in Southeast Asia, for example. There is no privacy in some Southeast Asian countries. And that's all culturally determined. But if you poison the well by taking it too far in one direction, it's very hard to come back from that. Once a whole bunch of information is out there, all of a sudden things like pattern of life activity and stuff like that become not as useful as they were. So it's in all of our interests to treat these principles, to David's point, as things that are absolutely worth striving for. Because if we don't do it now, in 10 years it's going to be a lot harder to put this stuff back in the bottle.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Ladies and gentlemen, it is lunchtime. We've had a fascinating discussion. I think one of the important principles for me that we've touched on this discussion is the importance of focusing on terminology. We're all speaking the same language and we're using the same words, and we're not checking that we actually understand the same things with those words. That goes for privacy and compliance by design, but also things like privacy and security. And we can have huge debates about how they aligned or not aligned, but we have different concepts in mind. So the importance of this common platform is it's important to share, but we need to develop a platform where we can have a meaningful discussion to identify where we actually agree and actually differ. The panel has done a great job. Please join me in thanking them, ladies and gentlemen.